Hi everyone, it's Ren here. Welcome to my room, guys. I hope you are as well today as I am. Today we're going to be talking about the genius of INFJ liberation, another installment in my series on INFJ genius. But as you will discover shortly, maybe not as easy to swallow as the two previous episodes. And I will leave it at that for now. For now, let me just remind you that I have written a book on the INFJ. Look at this lovely cover. If you want to get a hold of the Ecstatic Soul, a new look at the INFJ personality, deepest investigation of the INFJ currently in existence, it's all available down there in the description box below. All the links to all the Amazon websites, less than $10, ebook or paperback format. You help me, I'll help you. If you have any questions, you let me know. So first of all, what do I mean by INFJ liberation? What I mean by this is obviously a state which is neither alienation, the existential constitution of the alienated INFJ. I refer you back to chapters 1 to 4, possibly to the whole book, in fact. It's different from INFJ enlightenment, which is the topic of another video, which I like to associate with the Easter tradition, and particularly the tradition associated with the Buddha. INFJ liberation is more about a process. It's more about a transition from one state to the other. Because as much as you can picture, and alienated INFJs producing many works, which according to my hypothesis would be works coming together in a package with a metaphysics that is at least dualistic. In other words, looking at a different world out there, the possibility of something supernatural or spiritual, whatever you want to call it. And on the enlightened side is the creative genius that is able to produce works like Buddhist works, where peace is finally made with the oneness of the world and the world as it is. So very different kinds of works, which I have called, on the one hand, dualist works and quietist works. Dualism usually characterizing INFJ alienation, and quietism typically characterizing INFJ enlightenment. Now, INFJ liberation, which is all about a path leading from alienation to enlightenment, is a very interesting path because it has elements of both sides. But in the process, it has the strengths of both sides without necessarily possessing the weaknesses on both sides. So the strength of the alienated tradition of thinking is its constant creativity, its constant revolutionary character, its ability to continue plot forward and ask new questions. Its weakness is that it doesn't actually bring existential fulfillment, which is a problem. It brings a certain degree of intellectual fulfillment, but not so much existential fulfillment. On the other side, you have the INFJ enlightened state, which, especially insofar as the writings are concerned, has the advantage of offering, at least in theory, to bring existential fulfillment, and I think that's correct. Also, according to my book here, and that the path to existential fulfillment for an INFJ type is to accept the oneness of the world. If you accept the oneness of the world, you kind of have to admit that there is only one world, and it's the world right here. So you can make peace with that idea. The weakness, if I can call it that, shortcoming of this particular mode of being is that, first of all, we have to be honest and admit that it is not quite as intellectually stimulating as the alienated tradition. The first reason why it's not as intellectually satisfying is that it's not as revolutionary. It's not constantly creating new theories and testing them and moving from one movement to the next one and being always agitated. Like it's always exciting to discover what Western thought is going to come up with. Eastern thought, Eastern philosophy tends to be a lot more like this one big block that is hard to move. It's the whole point of enlightenment, but at the same time it means that it's not necessarily as exciting a ferment to be in. So depending on someone's personality, they might find strengths and weaknesses to both sides. When a person who, let's say, is also a thinking person and maybe someone who likes to write books, is undergoing liberation from alienation to enlightenment, and we kind of know that by the time they get to the end of the path, they will no longer be motivated to write revolutionary works, because that's in the nature of enlightenment. But while they're on that path, there is something revolutionary, perhaps the last revolution of the enlightened man, the newly enlightened man or woman. The last revolution is the revolution that leads them from an alienated mode of being to an enlightened mode of being. And that in itself is very fruitful. It's existentially fulfilling because it points towards the possibility of this fulfillment, this nirvana, if we wanted to talk in Buddhist terms. But at the same time, it is also intellectually very gratifying and satisfying, because it calls the entire Western tradition into question and shows the path toward a completely different approach. And so in this case, it starts with a deconstruction of the Western tradition and the Western obsession with alienation and the Western reification of an alienated mode of thinking into a dualism of mind and substance, or mind and matter specifically, and then reconstructs a path towards something that might look like, Buddhism or another Eastern philosophy, but through a Western lens, or something that is uniquely Western, but nevertheless culminates in this quietism, in this enlightenment, in this repose from the constant plodding forward of theory. And I think that there's room for particular types of genius happening in the middle of that in that field of liberation, because liberation takes a while to settle itself in motion and to reach its goals. And the space that the liberated but not yet enlightened INFJ occupies is a very interesting space. It's a space that is neither quite constructive in the Western tradition and sense, constructing systems, constructing frameworks, being like anti-dominance like Hegel, Marx, and Plato, for example. They construct systems, and then you're kind of asked whether or not to buy into the system. I mean, you could even make this point that Jung was one of those people who constructed a system. They're not either on the other side, where there is a rejection of system and a refusal to engage in this idea of system, because the very notion of this universal scheme that can act as the basis of everything that exists is rejected as one of those fake extra worlds, one of those fake hidden worlds. And instead what you get is a very deconstructive approach, but from an anti-dom's perspective. And usually what this deconstructive approach is, it looks at its tradition, so the tradition of Western philosophy, Western thought, and tries to emphasize all of the paradoxes that have been nourishing this tradition. They look at all the myths that have been lying under the surface to prop the justification of Western thought in its various incarnations. And when I say this, I also means Western science and the scientific community these days. The very idea that science points at truth with a capital T is a way of saying that science is capable of identifying a neutral ground, a neutral space, where what is true will be scintillating or standing out in some way, and what is not true will not. So in a way, science claims to be able to access this God's eye view. Of course, doesn't pretend to be able to access it through divine means, but through this idea that somehow truth is there to be discovered. In my experience, the liberated INFJ and the liberated NI dominant in general, my two best examples in this case are really the later Ludwig Wittgenstein, INFJ, and the late pragmatic philosopher Richard Rorty, INTJ. You get this calling into question of the ability that science would have of identifying this neutral ground, using Ludwig Wittgenstein's argument about private languages, not private languages, language games, sorry. Private language argument is something completely different. But language games, if we are all bound to play a particular language game or a series of language game, the scientific discourse, the scientific language, is also a language game. And so it's not ever able to get behind things as they are. Another way of saying it is when science claims that it's able to discover truth, it's denaturing its real nature, because when science makes a claim like that, it's making not a scientific claim, not a physical claim, because truth is not a physical notion, but a metaphysical notion. And remember that science, and more than ever in the 20th century, and since then up to the 21st, has always defined itself as making metaphysics passé, making metaphysics outdated. A scientist rejects by instinct the very notion of metaphysics, again as being locked up inside those hidden worlds. And yet when a scientist claims that science is able to discover truth that is out there, it's actually making just that kind of metaphysical claim. So a liberated INFJ and a liberated INTJ, they go quite far in calling into question a lot of the presuppositions of Western thought, and particularly this obsession with the idea that the truth is out there for us to discover and represent, rather than saying truth is made by us. Like truth is a property of sentences. The only theory that was ever convincingly developed as a theory of truth is a theory about whether sentences are true or not, whether propositions are true or not. You can apply the adjective, the epithet true, to a bit of language, a particularly structured bit of language. You cannot apply true to states of affairs. You cannot apply true to an object. It doesn't make any sense to say the table is true. Whether there is a table in my room or not is a statement that can be made true or false, but a statement is something I make. We use language to say things about the world, and the truth of what we say is a property of the sentences we utter. It's not a property of the world itself. And this calls into question a lot of scientific metaphysical presuppositions that ought to be eliminated according to the critics of this particular strand of thought. And I think that it can be shown that liberated INFJs alongside liberated INTJs play a big role in this, because their NI is very much capable of noticing, picking up the inconsistencies, the contradictions, the paradoxes, the myths that undergird all that kind of thinking. It's very uncomfortable for a lot of philosophers, and uncomfortable for a lot of scientists as well. In the case of the philosophers, it's sometimes uncomfortable because the philosophers who've been teaching metaphysics for a long time maybe are afraid they might lose their jobs as a result. But that's what the liberated INFJ does, because it's always saying, don't ever look for a world beyond. Not a metaphysical, heaven-like world beyond, but not either a world beyond that would consist in pure objects, like the pure objects of pure concept of truth, of goodness, of beauty, because you're just recreating the Platonic form in scientific language. So even that has to be called into question. And the deconstructive legacy of liberated INFJs and INTJs is precisely to point the way to possible enlightenment, but first of all by engaging in a work of deconstruction of liberation of the theories of the past from their mistaken presuppositions. It's a violent process, it's a difficult process, it's a resisted kind of process. It's historically fascinating, and it's one of, among the most exciting philosophy you can read, when philosophy takes a step back and looks at its own works and starts asking itself, where am I going with this? Am I really doing what I should be doing? Or am I just looking at the gods like I have been doing for the last 2,000 years? So these were just some meditations on the genius of INFJ liberation, somewhat abstract, to be completely honest, but I still hope you enjoyed those meditations, and I hope to see you soon. Consider giving me a like, adding a comment, and subscribing, guys. Bye-bye.